At 3:47 in the morning, I thought I had merely stumbled upon my husband's infidelity. By 6 o'clock, I understood I had cracked open a corporate machine running on hotel rooms, fake files, and men silenced by ambition. The woman who sent that text believed room 412 was her private trophy. Instead, I would make it the first crack in the day her carefully curated legacy collapsed. I am Maya Perry. I am 35 years old, and my entire professional existence relies on seeing the fractures other people prefer to ignore. As the director of risk analysis at Bracken Title and Trust, my career is built on anticipating collapse. A forged signature, a buried debt, a shell company holding a toxic asset. I analyze property records, and I tell the board exactly where the foundation will crack. When I stepped into my own bedroom, the clock still read 3:47. I had just driven home from a marathon 14-hour shift, dissecting a massive, bleeding commercial file that threatened to sink a merger. The house was entirely silent. The air conditioning hummed, sending a low, steady vibration through the hardwood floors. I slipped out of my heels in the hallway and carried them. I did not want to wake my husband. Grant Talbot was a heavy sleeper. He lay on his side, his breathing rhythmic, his shoulder rising and falling beneath the gray duvet. For 8 years, that quiet rhythm had been my anchor, the proof of a solid, ordinary life. Tonight, it was just background noise. I set my leather bag on the armchair in the corner. As I turned toward the master bathroom to wash my face, a sharp, artificial blue light sliced through the darkness. It came from the nightstand, Grant's phone. It was lying face up. That was a rare mistake. For the last 6 months, his phone had always been face down, on the dining table, on the kitchen island, on the dashboard of his car, face down. A silent, unacknowledged barrier between us. Tonight, exhausted perhaps by his own secrets, he had left the screen exposed. I walked over. The screen cast a pale, cold glow against the painted wall. It was a message notification, a photo preview followed by text. The image showed a mirror selfie taken in a hotel bathroom. Harsh overhead lighting, the curve of a woman's bare shoulder, the edge of a thick white towel. The sender was Evelyn Sloan. Evelyn Sloan was not a random woman from a bar. She was the senior vice president of development at Stonemere Urban Holdings, a rapidly expanding urban redevelopment corporation. She was a powerhouse in the city. More importantly, she was Grant's direct supervisor. I read the text glowing below the photograph. Room 412. Still warm from you. If your wife asks, say Memphis ran late. The words sat there, suspended in the blue light. They were meant to be intimate, a shared thrill between a rising executive and his powerful boss. To another wife. Those words might have been a physical blow. I might have gasped. I might have dropped to my knees. I might have grabbed Grant by the shoulders and screamed until my throat was raw. I did none of those things. I did not wake my husband. I did not cry. I did not throw the phone against the bedroom wall. Instead, my professional training engaged. A discrepancy had been located. A critical risk had been identified. The protocol was simple. Secure the evidence. Establish the timeline. Quantify the damage. I sat down on the very edge of the mattress. The springs did not creak. I picked up his phone. He had changed his passcode 2 months ago, claiming a corporate security update required it. He had forgotten that I watched his hands more closely than he realized. 4, 9, 8, 1. The device unlocked. I opened the messaging app. I did not read the messages first. Reading implies emotional investment. I approached it like a data extraction. I took my own phone from my jacket pocket. I opened the camera. I held my device directly above his, aligning the lenses perfectly to avoid the glare of the screen. Snap, scroll, snap. Scroll, snap. I captured every exchange going back to November. Dozens of images. I opened my email app. I drafted a new message to a secure, encrypted backup address that I had created years ago for sensitive whistleblower documents. No one knew the password, not even my assistant. I attached the photographs. I hit send. I watched the blue progress bar slide across the top of my screen until the confirmation checkmark appeared. The data was secure. The asset was protected. Only then did I allow myself to actually read what I had captured. I scrolled back to the top of the thread on his phone. There were the usual hallmarks of an illicit affair. Complaints about my demanding work schedule. Late-night check-ins. Hotel names. But as my eyes scanned the blue and gray bubbles, the cadence of the conversation felt entirely wrong. It did not read like a romance. It read like a transaction. They were mixing pleasure with extremely specific corporate maneuvers. "You were amazing today," Evelyn wrote on a Tuesday in March. "Make sure you push the vendor approvals through before the audit." "Thinking about your hands," Grant replied. "I handled the invoices. No one flagged the overages." I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. Overages. Vendor approvals. I scrolled faster. The vocabulary was shifting from an affair into a massive corporate liability. Parcel 9. Evelyn wrote on the 14th of April. "We need the zoning cleared by Friday. Use the discretionary fund. I need you focused for the legacy dinner." Parcel 9. I knew that name. Stonemere Urban Holdings had been aggressively acquiring land in the warehouse district for a massive revitalization project. Parcel 9 was the anchor property. It was highly contested. Then, a message from 3 days ago caught my eye. "Keep the lien quiet till Monday," Evelyn had ordered. "If compliance sees it, the whole structure burns. Room 412 tonight. Celebrate the close." That sentence did not belong in an affair. It belonged in a fraud case. I stared at that sentence until the letters blurred. A hidden lien on a commercial property like Parcel 9 was not just a clerical error. It was fraud. It was the kind of deliberate omission that ruins companies, destroys community projects, and sends executives to federal prison. Evelyn was not just sleeping with my husband. She was directing him to bury financial landmines. The infidelity was merely the cover story. The real betrayal was written in the ledger. I carefully locked Grant's phone. I placed it back on the nightstand, exactly where I had found it, millimeter perfect, face up. Let him wake up and think he had simply gotten away with his carelessness. I stood up and walked out of the bedroom. I walked down the dark hall and into the kitchen. I did not turn on the overhead lights. The only illumination came from the digital clock on the oven. 4:22. I filled the kettle. The sound of running water seemed deafening in the absolute silence of the house. I set it on the stove and waited for the boil. I leaned against the cold marble of the kitchen island. I closed my eyes and let the last 6 months replay in my mind, stripping away the filter of a trusting wife. The unexplained trips. "I have to do a site survey in Memphis," he had said just last week. A site survey for an urban redevelopment firm that had 0 active projects in Tennessee. The sudden influx of cash. He had started wearing a $6,000 watch in February. When I asked about it, he kissed my forehead and called it a performance bonus. Yet, the joint account showed no such deposit. The dinners, the constant networking, the way he would step out onto the patio to take calls, his voice dropping to a low, urgent murmur. I had attributed it to ambition. I had thought he was finally finding his footing at Stonemere. I had been proud of him. Now, I saw the true architecture of his deceit. He was not climbing the corporate ladder. He was being used as a shield. Evelyn Sloan was building her empire, and she was using Grant to sign the dirty paperwork. She kept him compliant with hotel rooms and whispered promises of power. She was holding him hostage with a secret he thought was purely sexual, while she weaponized his signature on fraudulent documents. The kettle whistled, a low, sharp sound. I poured the hot water over the coffee grounds. The bitter, dark smell filled the kitchen. I took my mug and sat at the small dining table by the window. Outside, the sky was beginning to turn a bruised, dark purple. The streetlights flickered and died. Morning was coming. I took a sip of the black coffee. It burned my tongue. I welcomed the sensation. It was sharp. It was real. A normal woman would be drafting a confrontation script right now. A normal woman would be packing a suitcase, sobbing onto folded sweaters. A normal woman would be planning to ruin his life by throwing his clothes onto the front lawn. But I am not a normal woman. I am an auditor. I am a risk analyst. I do not react. I dismantle. Evelyn Sloan thought she was untouchable. She thought room 412 was her private playground. She thought my husband was a convenient pawn, easily manipulated by a warm bed and a false sense of importance. She thought she had secured her legacy. She had no idea that she had just handed the blueprints of her destruction to a woman who specializes in tearing things down legally, structurally, and permanently. I watched the sun breach the horizon. I was no longer a wife mourning a marriage. I was an investigator standing at the edge of a pristine, undisturbed crime scene, and I was about to collect every single piece of evidence. For 8 years, I believed our marriage was an architectural marvel of balance. We had built this life side by side, hauling ourselves up from the cramped, damp apartments of our late 20s into the sleek, polished comfort of our current existence. Back in those early days, Grant was just a nameless junior trade analyst, grinding through endless spreadsheets in a windowless cubicle that constantly smelled of stale coffee and printer ozone. I was a junior risk assessor, slowly carving out my reputation in a male-dominated field by being terrifyingly meticulous. I caught the misplaced commas, the unverified signatures, the missing corporate seals that older, lazier auditors skimmed over. I thought we were the perfect ecosystem. I provided the bedrock, the rational mind, the fail-safe mechanism that kept our lives secure and moving forward. Grant brought the charm, the soft edges, the effortless charisma that I lacked. He was the man who knew exactly what the room wanted to hear before anyone even spoke. He could disarm an angry contractor with a well-timed joke and an easy smile, while I was the one quietly, ruthlessly verifying that same contractor's liability insurance in the background. We complemented each other flawlessly. I was the anchor, and he was the sail, or so I had convinced myself for nearly a decade. The architecture began to fracture exactly 6 months ago. The shifts were microscopic at first, the kind of subtle deviations a busy, trusting wife might easily write off as the natural evolution of a high-stress career trajectory. A new, sharp, aggressively spicy cologne suddenly replaced the familiar, warm cedar scent he had worn since our wedding day. His gym schedule, which had strictly been a rigorous morning routine for half a decade, morphed into late, unpredictable evening sessions that left him smelling more of exhaust fumes than exertion. He developed an abrupt, intense fascination with imported silk ties and heavy, ostentatious timepieces that cost more than our first car. Whenever I raised an eyebrow at a sudden luxury purchase or a late arrival where his explanations felt a little too rehearsed, he always had the same glossy, impregnable defense ready to deploy. "It is just professional networking. Maya," he would say, adjusting a perfect Windsor knot in the hallway mirror, his eyes completely steady, holding my gaze through the reflection. "You have to look the part if you want the executive room to take you seriously. It is an investment in our future. We are playing in the big leagues now." I accepted the logic because I wanted to. In the high-stakes, predatory ecosystem of urban development, where Stonemere Urban Holdings operated, perception often dictated reality. I wanted him to succeed. I wanted him to finally break through that suffocating middle management ceiling he had been complaining about for years. I gave him the benefit of the doubt, because that is what a supportive partner does. I ignored the tiny, persistent voice in my head that whispered about probabilities and deviations from the baseline. But my career is not built on perception, and it is certainly not built on blind trust. My entire professional existence is built on paper. And paper, unlike husbands, rarely lies. A few weeks ago, long before the harsh blue light of his phone illuminated my dark bedroom, a particular file crossed my desk at Bracken Title and Trust. It was supposed to be a standard, routine title sweep for a peripheral property. A small, unremarkable lot bordering a massive Stonemere Urban Holdings development zone. As I scrolled through the secondary vendor lists, running my usual cross-checks, a specific name snagged my attention and held it hostage: Ashbarrow Holdings. It was a perfectly bland, utterly forgettable corporate name, designed specifically not to be remembered, but to someone trained to look for negative space. It screamed loudly. It lacked the standard digital footprint a legitimate vendor of that size should possess. There was no listed operational history, no public cross-references with local contractors, no human names attached to the initial state filings. It felt entirely hollow, like a stage prop painted to look like a solid brick wall. That evening, the kitchen was filled with the warm, rich smell of roasting garlic and rosemary. Grant was standing by the marble island, humming under his breath, pouring us generous glasses of an overpriced Cabernet he had brought home to celebrate the end of a long week. I decided to drop the name into the conversation, keeping my tone perfectly casual, just to gauge the atmospheric pressure in the room. "I saw a weird entity on a Stonemere periphery sweep today," I said, leaning against the counter, watching the precise way his hands moved. "Ashbarrow Holdings. Are they one of your new subcontractors for the warehouse district expansion?" Grant did not freeze. He did not drop the heavy wine glass. His pulse did not even seem to flutter at his throat. He simply offered a smooth, practiced, deeply reassuring smile and handed me my drink, his fingers brushing mine. "Oh, them," he said lightly, taking a slow, savoring sip of his wine. "Just a middleman limited liability company. We use them to hold temporary leases during the messy zoning phases. It keeps the parent company insulated from local municipal red tape and nosy city council members. Completely standard practice in the development world. Honey, nothing to worry your pretty head about. Leave the zoning headaches to me." Standard practice. He used my own industry jargon to placate me, assuming I would not dig beneath the surface of his smooth explanation. He assumed the condescending term of endearment would shut down my analytical brain and return me to the role of the docile wife. He forgot exactly who he had married. He forgot that I dissect risk for a living. That light, dismissive smile was the exact friction needed to spark my professional paranoia into a raging inferno. My instincts flared, a silent, blaring alarm ringing constantly in my chest. Something was fundamentally, structurally wrong with the man standing in my kitchen, and by extension, the company he worked for. For the past 3 weeks, I had been operating under a quiet, methodical, terrifying obsession. I started staying at the office for hours after everyone else had packed up and gone home to their families. In the silent, fluorescent glow of the empty analytical floor, I bypassed the standard firm software and logged directly into the county clerk's public databases. I pulled every public land record I could legally access without triggering a corporate alert. I traced property transfer deeds backward through time, year by year. I cross-referenced mortgage histories, looking for the quiet, unrecorded transfer of massive debts. I mapped out the entire flow of property moving in and out of Stonemere's corporate orbit, creating a complex, tangled web of transactions on my secondary monitor. It did not take long for the web to tighten relentlessly around the anomaly. I isolated Ash Barrow Holdings. I pulled their state and corporation documents, paying the small fee out of my own pocket to keep it off the firm's ledger. The registered address was not a corporate suite in a downtown high-rise. It was not a working warehouse in the industrial district. It was a mail drop location on the 4th floor of a dilapidated strip mall on the extreme western edge of the city. A shared office space where anyone could rent a numbered metal mailbox for $50 a month. A digital ghost town. I knew exactly what that meant. It is the precise type of address shell companies use to launder dirty money, mask corporate liability, and permanently hide the names of their true beneficiaries from government regulators, tax auditors, and curious wives. I had been staring at that mail drop address on my monitor for weeks, trying to calculate the exact trajectory of the financial fraud. I had been losing sleep trying to figure out if my husband was the brilliant, hidden architect of a massive corporate scam, or merely the gullible, handsome Mark being set up to take the inevitable fall. Now, sitting alone at my kitchen table as the morning sun fully breached the horizon and bathed the room in a harsh, unforgiving daylight, all the disparate pieces snapped together with sickening, mathematical clarity. Grant's expensive new watch, the mysterious, untraceable evening networking events that left no paper trail, the hollow shell company embedded deep within his firm's vendor lists. And finally, the text message at 3:47 in the morning instructing him to keep a financial lien quiet until Monday. The message from Evelyn Sloan was not the inciting incident of my nightmare. It was not the spark that started the fire burning down my life. The realization settled over me, cold and heavy as a lead apron. That text message was merely a high-powered flashlight, suddenly clicking on in the pitch black, pointing exactly at the structural rot I had already been tracing for weeks. The infidelity, the hotel room, the physical betrayal. It was just the cheapest, most predictable symptom of a much deeper, much more dangerous corporate infection. I did not hire a divorce attorney. Family law practitioners are trained to hunt for hidden assets, negotiate alimony, and manage the emotional wreckage of broken vows. I did not care about the division of our furniture, and I certainly did not care about my husband's emotional state. I needed someone who looked at financial ledgers the way a homicide detective looks at blood spatter. I needed an apex predator of the spreadsheet. I hired Tessa Brewer. Tessa was an independent forensic accountant who operated entirely off the grid of the major corporate firms. Her primary specialty was auditing commercial developments, specifically hunting down bloated construction budgets, phantom supply chains, and padded vendor costs. She arrived at the temporary workspace I had leased on a Tuesday morning, carrying 2 encrypted laptops and a thermos of black tea. She did not offer sympathy. She asked for the bank logins, the routing numbers, and absolute silence. Within 48 hours, Tessa cracked the surface of Grant's financial ecosystem. It was an insultingly simple mechanism, completely devoid of the sophistication I would have expected from an executive. Grant had been quietly siphoning money out of our primary joint savings account for nearly 9 months. He kept the withdrawals microscopic to avoid triggering my automated bank alerts. $60 on a Monday, $120 on a Thursday. To the casual observer, it mirrored the standard, messy expenditures of daily life. But Tessa mapped the velocity of the cash. She laid a timeline across her monitors, showing exactly how Grant was replenishing those exact amounts. 2 weeks after every withdrawal, our account would receive a direct deposit from Stonemere Urban Holdings, categorized neatly as a corporate expense reimbursement. He is acting as his own micro-lender, Tessa explained, pointing a pen at the screen. He takes your joint cash to fund the illicit activities, files a manipulated expense report, and lets his employer reimburse the marital account to keep the balance flat. It is sloppy, but it gets worse. Tessa did not stop at the reimbursements. She tracked where Grant's initial cash injections were actually going. The money was not just paying for discreet hotel suites and high-end steakhouse dinners. A significant percentage of those funds was being funneled into a third-party digital payment processor. From there, it fed directly into a deeply opaque consulting account registered under a generic acronym. Tessa spent another 24 hours hammering at the firewall of that consulting account until she breached the vendor list. The money did not stay there. It was quietly routed out the back door, systematically distributed into the operating accounts of 3 different subcontractors currently laying concrete and steel for Stonemere's latest projects. Grant was not merely hiding an affair. He was functioning as a localized money launderer. He was washing tiny fractions of personal cash through the corporate expense system to illegally subsidize subcontractor kickbacks. The infidelity was a distraction. It was the shiny object meant to keep everyone looking the wrong way. I told Tessa to freeze the deep dive on Grant and turn the entire forensic laser onto Evelyn Sloan. We pulled her complete professional history. 13 years operating at the highest levels of commercial real estate. 4 distinct executive vice president roles at 4 entirely separate urban development firms. On paper, her trajectory was a masterpiece of ambition. She never stayed at any single company for longer than 40 months. She always left cleanly, showered with industry praise, moving upward to a larger salary and a more prestigious title. However, when Tessa ran the corporate filings for those 4 companies in the immediate aftermath of Evelyn's departures, a terrifyingly precise pattern emerged. Every single time she vacated a position, the company she left behind initiated a sudden, unpublicized internal restructuring within 90 days. Entire compliance departments were gutted. Project budgets were drastically restated. Mid-level managers were quietly terminated with non-disclosure agreements. Evelyn always managed to exit the building just before the financial foundation collapsed, leaving her subordinates trapped inside the rubble. Data is vital, but I needed human intelligence to understand the mechanics of her survival. I needed to know how she operated the people beneath her. I spent a weekend cross-referencing archival staff directories and eventually tracked down a woman named Elise Rowan, 5 years ago. Elise had been Evelyn's executive assistant at her third firm. She had resigned abruptly, entirely abandoning her career in corporate real estate to manage a quiet bakery in the suburbs. I arranged to meet Elise in the parking lot of a grocery store at 6 in the morning. She sat in the passenger seat of my car, clutching a paper coffee cup, her eyes constantly darting toward the rearview mirror. "Evelyn treats corporate policy like a suggestion," Elise told me, her voice tight and defensive. "She used to order me to book luxury hotel suites using strictly coded project development funds. A week later, after the charges cleared, she would march into my cubicle, hand me a revised itinerary, and force me to alter the central ledger. A private weekend getaway magically became a municipal zoning strategy session, if I hesitated. She would simply remind me how difficult it was for a junior assistant to find work without a glowing letter of recommendation. She makes you complicit in her lies, so you can never testify against her. Elise gave me the methodology, but I still needed to understand the leverage. I needed to know what happened to the men Evelyn selected. Digging deeper into the casualties of those 4 internal restructurings, I found Colleen Avery. 3 years ago, Colleen had been happily married to a senior logistics manager at Evelyn's second firm. Today, she was a single mother working 2 administrative jobs, still paying off the legal debts her ex-husband had accumulated during his sudden, catastrophic termination. I sat across from Colleen in a sterile coffee shop downtown when I mentioned Evelyn Sloan. The exhaustion in Colleen's face hardened into something cold and rigid. "My husband thought he was brilliant," Colleen said, staring flatly at the table. "He thought he had earned it. Evelyn promoted him twice in the span of 18 months. She gave him a massive discretionary budget. She took him on exclusive, private scouting trips. He was entirely under her spell." Then, one Thursday afternoon, she placed a stack of environmental waivers on his desk and asked him to backdate his signature by 6 months to cover up a toxic soil violation. He finally panicked. He refused to sign. He told her it was a federal offense. Colleen took a slow, deep breath, steadying her hands. By the following Monday, he was fired for gross financial negligence. She engineered an entire paper trail proving he had been embezzling project funds to pay for luxury travel, the same travel she had mandated. She destroyed his career, bankrupted our family, and decimated his reputation, all because he refused to hold the pen for her crimes. Every fragmented piece of data, every hesitant confession, suddenly locked together into a terrifying, flawless picture. Evelyn Sloan was not a woman who stole other women's husbands out of lust or boredom. She was an apex predator who utilized sex, rapid career advancement, and enforced secrecy as bindings. She targeted ambitious, malleable men like Grant, men who were desperate to cross the threshold into the executive suite. She lured them in with the intoxicating thrill of an affair with a powerful woman, elevating their status and inflating their egos. Once they were emotionally and physically compromised, she slowly entangled them in her fraudulent financial architecture. She used the illicit relationship as a permanent form of blackmail, knowing absolutely that a married, status-obsessed mid-level manager would gladly sign a dirty invoice before he would ever risk exposing his infidelity to his wife and his peers. Sitting in the silence of my car after leaving the coffee shop, a chilling realization settled over me, freezing the blood in my veins. Grant was not a tragedy of lost love. He was a standardized data point in a sociopathic algorithm. He was not the first man to betray his wife in the shadow of Evelyn Sloan. He was simply the newest cog in a sophisticated, ruthless model of manipulation that had been sharpened and perfected over a decade. He was a human shield, blindly holding the liability for a woman who would inevitably destroy him the moment he ceased to be useful. I waited 4 days, 96 hours of playing the role of the oblivious, dedicated wife. It required a level of psychological discipline I did not know I possessed. We ate dinner together. We discussed his commute. We shared a bed. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to his steady breathing, feeling absolutely nothing but the cold, hard steel of my own resolve taking shape. During daylight hours, while he was at the Stonemere offices, I dismantled our shared life with surgical precision. I visited 3 different bank branches in person. I locked down every personal account, transferring my exact percentage of the marital assets into a new heavily encrypted trust. I sat in the hushed, mahogany-paneled office of Laurel Vance, handing over the preliminary evidentiary binders. Laurel was a divorce attorney who viewed marriage dissolution not as a tragedy, but as a hostile corporate takeover. She did not offer me a tissue. She offered me a strategy. I secured the physical deed to our home, scanning it and locking the original in a safety deposit box. Only when the perimeter was completely secured, when every escape route was blocked and the legal traps were set, did I finally bring the hammer down. It was Thursday evening, 7:30. The house was quiet. The dishwasher was humming in the background. Grant was standing by the kitchen island, loosening his expensive silk tie, pouring himself a glass of sparkling water. I sat at the head of the long oak dining table. "Grant," I said. My voice was entirely flat, devoid of any inflection. "Bring your water and sit down." He glanced over, a manufactured smile forming on his lips. He walked over and pulled out the chair to my right. "What is going on? You look incredibly serious." I did not answer him with words. I opened the thick leather portfolio I had resting on my lap. I took out the first stack of paper and placed it perfectly in the center of the table. It was the photographs of his text messages, the glaring blue screen, the bathroom mirror, the exposed shoulder, the text from Evelyn Sloan. Grant looked down. The manufactured smile did not just fade, it shattered. The color drained from his face so rapidly I could see the sudden, stark contrast of his weekend tan against his bloodless skin. He opened his mouth to speak, but his throat seized before he could formulate a lie. I placed the second stack of paper down. This was not about infidelity anymore. I laid out the meticulously color-coded cash flow spreadsheets Tessa had generated. I placed the printed calendar grids, matching his hotel check-ins directly against the dates of his submitted corporate expense reports. And finally, I set down a single, crisp white sheet of paper, printed in the dead center, in heavy black ink, were 2 words, Ashbarrow Holdings. I watched his eyes track across the documents. I expected denial. I expected rage. I expected him to flip the table or scream that I had violated his privacy. Instead, the man sitting next to me simply caved in. It was a pathetic, instantaneous structural failure. His shoulders slumped, his chest hollowed out, and he buried his face in his trembling hands. "Maya," he whispered, the sound muffled by his fingers. "Oh God, Mia." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded on the polished wood. I did not reach out. I did not comfort him. I waited for the confession to spill, knowing it would be a messy, self-serving flood. "It started in Seattle," he stammered, dropping his hands, refusing to meet my eyes. "The Regional Development Conference last October. She cornered me in the lobby lounge after the main dinner. She just kept buying drinks. She kept looking at me and telling me I had real leadership potential. She said the other executives were blind to my talent. She made me feel like I was finally visible." He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically across the spreadsheets on the table, desperately trying to gauge exactly how much of his ruin was documented. "I swear to you, I thought it was just a physical thing," he pleaded, his voice rising in pitch. "I thought it was just an affair, a terrible, stupid mistake." But then we got back to the office. She started bringing me files, just small things at first. Documents that she said needed to be cleaned up for efficiency. Temporary confirmations of receipt that bypassed the usual audit queue. I did not want to do it, but she pushed the paperwork across my desk the exact same week she recommended me for the senior director promotion. He leaned forward, pressing his palms flat against the table, begging me to understand the mechanics of his cowardice. I did not understand all of it. "Maya," he insisted, tears finally pooling in the corners of his eyes. "I did not see the big picture. You have to believe me. She isolates you. She makes you feel like you are the only one she trusts. And everyone around Evelyn does it. It is just the culture of her division. You bend the rules. You sign the expedited forms. Or you get pushed out completely." I was just trying to secure our future. The sheer audacity of his rationalization hung in the air, heavy and toxic. He was actually trying to reframe his corruption as a sacrifice for our marriage. He wanted me to view him as a victim of a predatory corporate culture, rather than a willing participant who traded his integrity for a larger paycheck and a hotel room. I looked at him. I stripped away the 8 years of shared history, the inside jokes, the vacations, the life we had built. I looked at him as an auditor looks at a compromised asset. "Not understanding everything does not make you innocent," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a razor blade. "It just proves you are easy to use." Grant flinched. The words struck him with physical force. He stared at me, his mouth open, completely paralyzed by the absolute zero temperature of my reaction. He had prepared for a screaming match. He had prepared for a weeping, heartbroken wife. He had no defense against a woman who had already moved past the emotional betrayal and was currently executing a liquidation. "I want you out of this house by Friday evening," I told him, keeping my gaze locked onto his terrified eyes. "Pack whatever you need for the foreseeable future. Leave your house keys on the kitchen counter. Laurel Vance has already filed the dissolution of marriage paperwork with the county clerk. You will be formally served at the Stonemere corporate office on Monday morning." "Maya, please," he begged, reaching across the table. I pulled my arms back, out of his reach. "You cannot do this. We can fix this. I will resign. I will tell the board everything." "You will do nothing," I commanded, my tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. I deliberately held back the vast majority of my intelligence. I did not mention the shell company network. I did not mention Elise or Colleen. I let him operate under the desperate delusion that I was merely a scorned wife armed with a few fraudulent expense reports. I needed him to think the blast radius was confined to our dining room. He slowly pushed his chair back. The wood scraped harshly against the floorboards. He stood up, looking entirely lost in the home he had helped purchase. He walked toward the front hallway, his footsteps heavy and defeated. He reached for his jacket hanging on the hook. He paused with his hand on the brass doorknob. The silence in the house was absolute, thick enough to choke on. He turned back to face me. The pathetic, pleading energy was gone, replaced by a dark, chilling certainty. The reality of his situation had finally pierced his panic. "If Evelyn thinks you are going to talk," he said, his voice dropping into a hollow, gravelly rasp, "she will not let any of us live in peace." He opened the door and walked out into the night, leaving the threat hanging in the air. He was wrong. I knew exactly who I was dealing with, and I was counting on her to fight back. The phone call arrived on a Tuesday afternoon at precisely 2:15. I was sitting at my desk at Bracken Title and Trust, reviewing a zoning compliance report, when my personal cell phone vibrated. The caller identification was restricted. I answered it anyway, pressing the phone to my ear while keeping my eyes fixed on my monitor. "Maya," a voice said. She said my name the way executives announce decisions, not the way people begin conversations. The voice was smooth, perfectly modulated, and layered with the kind of expensive polish that takes years of media training to perfect. It was the voice of a woman who was entirely accustomed to dictating the terms of reality to a room full of men in tailored suits. "This is Evelyn Sloan," she continued. "I believe we have a mutual situation that requires some adult management." She did not sound like a woman caught sleeping with another woman's husband. She sounded like a senior partner addressing a minor, irritating logistical error on a subsidiary project. There was no tremor of guilt, no rushed apology, no performative shame. Her tone was strictly transactional, heavily saturated with a patronizing patience, as if she were doing me a massive favor by lowering herself to make this call. "I am listening," I replied, my voice as flat and unyielding as the marble lobby of her corporate headquarters. "Grant informed me that he has vacated your residence," Evelyn said, sighing softly, painting herself as the exhausted mediator in a messy domestic squabble. "I understand you are feeling betrayed. That is a natural, albeit emotional, response. However, we are all professionals here. Grant is a valuable asset to my team at Stonemere. A messy, protracted public divorce would be incredibly distracting for him, and frankly, detrimental to the upward trajectory he has worked so hard to achieve." She paused, letting the implication hang in the dead air. I let her spin her web. "I am a woman who firmly believes in clean breaks and fresh starts," Evelyn continued, her voice dropping into a register of faux intimacy. "I would like to propose a discreet resolution, a substantial financial settlement. Let us call it a transition fund. We can arrange for an untraceable transfer of $250,000 to an account of your choosing. It gives you immediate freedom. It keeps the attorneys out of the mud, and it ensures Grant's career remains unblemished. Everyone walks away whole." She was trying to buy my silence, assuming my anger had a fixed market price. She fundamentally misunderstood the currency we were trading in. "A transition fund," I repeated, tasting the corporate jargon. "That is a very elegant way to phrase hush money. Tell me, Evelyn, which budget code would you use for that? Would you classify my marriage under community outreach, or would you bury it in the discretionary vendor accounts?" Excuse me. The smooth polish cracked just a fraction of an inch. A sharp, icy edge bled through. "I am offering you a very generous exit strategy. Maya, I suggest you take it before the offer is rescinded." I leaned back in my office chair. I closed the zoning report on my monitor. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the terrifying, absolute precision of an auditor reading a terminal diagnosis. "I do not want your money, Evelyn," I said slowly. "I am much more interested in the $75,000 you authorized on the 14th of April. The payment routed from the Stonemere operating account through a third-party digital processor directly into Ash Barrow Holdings. I am also quite fascinated by the directive you issued on the 12th of May, instructing Grant to keep a fraudulent mechanic's lien perfectly quiet until Monday morning. And of course, I am intimately aware of what you two were celebrating in room 412 while the ink was still wet." The silence that rushed through the receiver was absolute. It was profound. It was the sound of a predator realizing it had just walked blindly into a steel trap. For 10 agonizing seconds, there was not a single intake of breath. The ambient background noise of her spacious executive office seemed to vanish. I could practically hear the gears violently grinding to a halt in her head as she desperately tried to calculate the exact scope of the catastrophic data breach. She had assumed I was a weeping housewife clutching a handful of printed text messages. I had just demonstrated that I was holding the architectural blueprints to her federal indictment. "You have no idea what you are talking about," Evelyn finally snapped. But the patronizing calm was entirely gone. Her voice was thin, brittle, vibrating with genuine panic. "Do not call this number again," I said, and I disconnected the line. I knew her panic would demand immediate action. She would not just sit there. She would try to accelerate her timeline. I needed to understand what she was racing toward. Why was she so desperate to keep Grant's reputation intact right now, during my lunch hour? I bypassed the financial ledgers and started pulling public relations files. I ran Evelyn Sloane's name through the local philanthropic registries, the society pages, and the municipal event calendars. It took less than 20 minutes to find the monument she was so frantically trying to protect. In exactly 19 days, the Cedar Vale Civic Conservatory was hosting its grand annual gala. It was the most prestigious philanthropic event in the state. A glittering convergence of old money, political power, and corporate influence. The centerpiece of the evening was the presentation of the Legacy Builder Award. This year, the sole recipient was Evelyn Sloane. I read the official press release glowing on my screen. It made my stomach turn. The conservatory was not just giving her a glass trophy. They were permanently renaming their flagship urban development scholarship. It was going to be christened the Sloane Fellowship. The promotional materials painted her as a flawless feminist icon, a pioneering mentor for young women entering commercial real estate, a generous patron of community arts, and the absolute embodiment of integrity in corporate leadership. She had weaponized feminism to build a fortress of public goodwill. She used her carefully curated image as a benevolent leader to completely blind the public to the ruthless, predatory exploitation she enacted behind closed doors. She ruined the careers of honest men, bullied young female assistants into falsifying documents, and used my husband to launder kickbacks, all while smiling for the cameras and accepting awards for her outstanding moral character. But the most devastating piece of the puzzle, the revelation that fundamentally altered the chemical composition of my anger, was buried in the fine print of her upcoming acceptance speech outline, which Tessa had managed to extract from a compromised Stonemere server. Evelyn intended to use the gala to publicly announce the groundbreaking of her crown jewel Parcel 9. She was pitching it as a revolutionary model of community-integrated development. I pulled up the geographical overlay for Parcel 9 again, zooming in on the exact coordinates she had targeted for the new commercial footprint. The aggressive expansion boundaries pushed far past the derelict warehouses. They encroached directly onto a dense, wooded tract of land bordering the river. My breath caught in my throat. I recognized those coordinates. It was a protected green space. It was land tethered to a strict environmental conservation easement. An easement that had been painstakingly negotiated, funded, and legally established by a coalition of local environmentalists 15 years ago. The lead signatory on that conservation trust had been my father, Arthur Perry. My father had spent the last decade of his life fighting corporate developers in court to ensure that specific patch of old-growth trees remained untouched. He had exhausted his savings to secure that easement. And now, Evelyn Sloan was using fabricated shell companies, fraudulent vendor payouts, and my own husband's coerced signatures to quietly dissolve those environmental protections so she could pour concrete over my father's legacy. She was not just stealing my present. She was systematically bulldozing my past. I sat back in the dim light of my office. The air in the room felt incredibly thin. The narrative had shifted entirely. This was no longer a domestic dispute. It was no longer a simple equation of a cheating husband and a jealous rival. Evelyn Sloan had built a towering monument to herself on a foundation of crushed careers, extorted signatures, and stolen land. She believed the blinding glare of her public halo would forever hide the rot underneath. She was wrong. I was not going to demand a divorce settlement. I was not going to leak a rumor. I was going to wait for her to put on her designer gown, step under the brightest lights of the city, and reach out to claim her crown. And then, with the entire city watching, I was going to pull the foundation out from under her and let the monument fall on its own. The isolation is the most critical component of a successful fraud. The architect of the scam must convince every single participant that they are alone, that their specific failure or their specific secret is unique to them. Once the targets are isolated, they are entirely powerless. Evelyn Sloan had built her entire career on this exact principle. She kept her victims segregated, trapped in their own individual silos of shame and ruined reputations. My job was simply to open the doors between those silos. Through Colleen Avery, I was introduced to Dana Mercer. Dana was a quiet, fiercely intelligent woman who had lost her marriage and her home 2 years ago. Her husband had been a senior procurement officer under Evelyn. He was ultimately pushed out and publicly scapegoated for a massive string of inflated material invoices. He took the fall for nearly $500,000 in phantom structural steel, a discrepancy that miraculously vanished from the corporate ledger the moment he was terminated. Through Elise Rowan, the former assistant, we managed to track down a former project manager who had completely fled the commercial real estate industry. We spoke to him over a secure, encrypted audio line. His voice shook as he confirmed the exact, terrifying mechanism of Evelyn's control. He detailed how she had promised him a vice president title, initiated a brief physical relationship during a zoning conference in Chicago, and then, barely 3 weeks later, handed him a heavily modified environmental impact report to sign. When he hesitated, recognizing the backdated water testing data as a felony, Evelyn did not yell. She merely smiled, adjusted her jacket, and casually asked if his pregnant wife would enjoy reading the room service receipts from their shared suite. He signed the document. He resigned 6 months later, his spirit completely broken. I realized we possessed enough raw intelligence to form a complete picture. But raw intelligence is entirely useless unless it is organized into a weapon. I arranged a meeting for early Sunday morning. We gathered at Elise's Bakery, located deep in a quiet, residential suburb, far away from the polished glass towers of the downtown financial district. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. The bakery was not yet open to the public. The air inside was heavy with the warm, comforting scent of rising yeast and melted butter, a jarring contrast to the absolute devastation we were there to discuss. The front display cases were empty. The neon open sign was dark, and the front door was bolted shut. We sat around a large, flour-dusted wooden prep table in the back kitchen. Tessa Brewer sat to my left, her forensic accounting files neatly stacked. Laurel Vance, my attorney, sat to my right, her legal pads ready. Across from us sat the survivors Colleen, Dana, and Elise. For the first 20 minutes, no one had to play the polite society game. There was no need for the forced smiles, the careful corporate jargon, or the exhausting pretense that everything was fine. In the harsh fluorescent light of the commercial kitchen, the shared trauma was a tangible presence in the room as they began to speak. Their individual stories wove together into a single, horrifying tapestry. The sequence was perfectly replicated every time. It began with a sudden, intoxicating attention from a powerful superior. Then came the aggressive flattery, the whispered promises of executive promotion, and the deliberate blurring of professional boundaries. This was immediately followed by the sexual entanglement, which was never about passion, but always about manufacturing a secret. Finally, the trap snapped shut. The target, now bound by the fear of personal ruin, was violently pushed into the mud and forced to carry the liability for Evelyn's fraudulent paperwork. Colleen cried softly as Dana described the exact same look of hollow terror her husband had worn the night he was fired. Elise reached out and held Dana's hand. They were women who had never met before this morning, yet they were speaking the exact same language, fluently translating the shared vocabulary of the wreckage Evelyn had left behind. I let them share their grief, but I knew that grief alone would not secure a conviction. I stood up from the table. I looked at the 5 women surrounding me. "I hear you," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy, emotional atmosphere. "I know exactly what she took from you, but you must understand how Evelyn survives. She survives by controlling the narrative. If we walk into a boardroom or a news station right now and scream about ruined marriages and stolen promotions, she will win. She will look at the camera, project her perfect, polished calm, and dismiss us as a group of hysterical, bitter women. The world always forgives a successful executive when the only alternative is a messy, unverified scandal." I placed my hands flat on the wooden table. "We are not going to be bitter," I instructed them, locking eyes with each woman. "We are going to be precise. From this exact second forward, no one speaks of a feeling they cannot back up with a document. If you cannot prove it, it did not happen. We strip the emotion out of the prosecution." I turned to Elise. "I do not want to hear that she was cruel to you. I want the exact dates she ordered you to alter the central ledger, the specific project codes you used, and the corresponding hotel booking logs." I looked at Colleen and Dana. "I do not want to hear about your husband's depression. I want the emails where they question the inflated invoices. I want the dates of the backdated waivers. I want the bank statements showing the exact moment their severance pay was frozen." I pointed to Tessa. "Tessa will link your dates to the Stonemere corporate bank routing numbers. Laurel will draft sworn, legally binding affidavits for every single verified claim. We are going to build a cage entirely out of paper, and we are going to weld it shut with her own metadata. The discipline of the mandate shifted the oxygen in the room. The tears stopped. The posture of the women at the table changed. They stopped slouching. The sheer, rigid structure of my demand gave them something solid to hold on to. It gave them a framework where their pain was no longer a liability. It was a verifiable data point. Evelyn's entire defense strategy relies on breaking her targets individually, I continued, outlining the battle plan. She corners you alone. She threatens you alone. Therefore, we do not attack her individually. We will move as a single, coordinated unit. We will strike at the exact moment she believes she is completely untouchable. We will release the legal filings, the financial proof, and the sworn testimony simultaneously. We will hit the lenders, the board of directors, and the press in the exact same hour. We give her no space to breathe, no time to draft a denial, and no isolated target to counterattack. Laurel nodded sharply, her pen flying across the legal pad. Tessa was already typing furiously, building the new timelines into her database. I looked at Colleen, Dana, and Elise. The fear that had lived behind their eyes for years was steadily burning away, replaced by a cold, magnificent clarity. We were no longer a support group of betrayed wives and abused assistants, standing around trading stories of our misery. The emotional transition in the bakery was profound and absolute. As the morning sun finally broke through the small, high windows of the kitchen, casting long shadows across the flour-covered table, the transformation was complete. We were no longer standing in the wreckage of Evelyn Sloane's ambition. We were a coordinated team, quietly preparing to dismantle her machine piece by piece. The hardest part of dismantling a life is not the war you wage against your enemies. It is the collateral damage you are forced to inflict upon the people you love. My cousin, Julia Perry, sat on the edge of my living room sofa on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. Julia was the vice chair of the Cedar Vale Civic Conservatory Gala Planning Committee. For 8 months, she had poured her entire soul into organizing the event. She had also known me for my entire life, which meant she could read the subtle, dangerous shifts in my behavior. "You are going to blow up the gala," Julia said. Her voice was trembling, her hands tightly gripping a porcelain teacup. "I know Grant moved out. I know about Evelyn Sloane. The rumors are already whispering through the committee that you have retained aggressive legal counsel. Maya, you cannot detonate a scandal on that stage." "Evelyn Sloane is a predator," I replied, keeping my voice gentle but unyielding. "She is building her empire on stolen land and ruined families. I cannot allow her to stand at a podium and accept an award for moral leadership." Julia set her teacup down with a sharp clatter. "Then leak the affair to the press. Send the hotel receipts to her board of directors. Destroy her marriage. Take her job. But please, Maya, do not touch the community program. The Sloan Fellowship is fully funded. It is designated for first-generation college students who desperately need that money to survive unpaid internships. If you create a massive public spectacle that ties the foundation to corporate fraud, the board will panic. They will freeze the entire endowment to distance themselves from the legal fallout. Innocent people will lose their chance." I looked away from her pleading eyes. For the first time since this began, a deep, agonizing fracture formed in my resolve. I felt entirely torn in half. The righteous anger burning in my chest demanded that I crush Evelyn completely, leaving absolutely nothing of her legacy standing. But Julia was right. The students relying on that money knew nothing about shell companies or backdated environmental waivers. I did not want to become the kind of woman who burned down a village just to catch one single thief. I spent a sleepless night wrestling with the morality of my own vengeance. The next morning, I walked into Laurel Vance's law office. "We need to adjust the angle of the blade," I told my attorney, sitting across her broad oak desk. "If we hit the conservatory publicly without warning, they will freeze the scholarship funds to protect their own liability. The students become collateral damage. I need a way to kill the name without killing the money." Laurel leaned back, tapping a gold pen against her chin. She did not argue with my sudden burst of conscience. She simply recalculated the legal strategy. "We do not destroy the fund," Laurel said finally, her eyes gleaming with sharp intelligence. "We decapitate it. The money Evelyn pledged has already been transferred into an irrevocable trust managed by the conservatory. Legally, she cannot take it back. What we will do is prepare a strictly confidential, highly redacted executive summary of the financial fraud. We will deliver it to the conservatory's board of trustees privately, exactly 48 hours before the gala." I saw the brilliance of the maneuver immediately. "We force their hand in private," I said, finishing her thought. "We give them undeniable proof that their star donor is facing imminent federal indictment. They will be legally obligated to sever ties to protect the institution. They keep the money, but they will be forced to strip her name from the fellowship." Laurel smiled thinly. "Exactly. The fund survives, but Evelyn's fake legacy is erased." I felt a profound sense of relief, but the emotional gauntlet of the week was not over. On Friday evening, the doorbell rang. It was not a courier or a lawyer. It was Helen Talbot, Grant's mother. She looked small and fragile standing on my porch, holding a damp tissue in her hands. I invited her inside. We sat at the kitchen table, the exact spot where I had confronted her son just over a week ago. Helen did not try to defend Grant's infidelity. She was a practical, traditional woman who believed deeply in the sanctity of marriage, and her son's betrayal had broken her heart as well. But she was still a mother fighting for her child's survival. "He looks like a ghost, Maya." Helen wept softly, wiping her cheeks. "He came to my house. He told me everything. He told me about the documents and the terrible things that woman made him do. I am not asking you to take him back. I know that bridge is burned to ash. But please, I am begging you, do not push him into the public light. Do not give his name to the authorities." I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. Her skin was cold. It physically hurt me to see her in this much pain. I had loved this woman. She had welcomed me into her family unconditionally. "He is a good boy," Helen pleaded, her voice cracking. "He is foolish. Yes, he was weak, but he is not malicious. He did not build this scheme. He was just trapped in it." I squeezed her hand gently, but I did not offer her the false comfort she was seeking. I had to maintain the absolute clarity of my boundaries. "Helen," I said, my voice heavy with genuine sorrow, "I am not building a trap for Grant. I am not actively trying to destroy him out of spite. But I am refusing to stand in front of the train he voluntarily decided to drive. He signed those documents. He moved the money. He chose his ambition over his integrity long before Evelyn Sloan ever invited him to a hotel room." Helen let out a quiet, shattered sob. "The things that are going to happen next are not an act of excessive revenge," I explained, looking directly into her tear-filled eyes. I am not creating an artificial punishment. The consequences are simply the truth finally arriving at its correct address. Grant has to answer for his own signature. She left my house an hour later, carrying a grief I could not alleviate. I sat alone in the quiet living room, exhausted by the emotional toll of holding everyone accountable. I wondered if I was waiting too long. I wondered if my desire to engineer the perfect surgical strike at the gala was giving Evelyn too much time to maneuver. The answer arrived at 9:15 that evening. My laptop chimed with an incoming message on the encrypted email account I had set up for Tessa. But it was not from Tessa. The sender address was Grant's personal email. The subject line contained one word: urgent. I opened the message. The text was disjointed, written in a state of absolute, blind panic. Maya, you have to do something now. She knows someone is looking. Evelyn initiated a sudden internal audit protocol this afternoon. 2 commercial shredding trucks have been parked at the loading dock of Stonemere since 4 o'clock. She has completely revoked my administrative access to the central servers. My keycard no longer works on the executive floor. I saw her assistant carrying boxes of the Parcel 9 vendor files into her private office. She is wiping the physical paper trail. I think she is fabricating a secondary set of ledgers to make it look like I orchestrated the entire Ashbarrow Holdings transfer on my own. She is going to bury me before Monday. I stared at the glowing screen, the words burning into my retinas. A cold weight dropped through my chest. I had spent the last 2 weeks carefully arranging the board on a chessboard, ensuring every single piece was perfectly positioned for a flawless checkmate. I had focused so intently on the gala, on the poetic justice of destroying her on a public stage, that I had underestimated the raw, desperate survival instincts of a cornered predator. Evelyn was not waiting for the gala. She was rewriting history right now. She was destroying the physical evidence, quarantining the digital data, and aggressively building a firewall entirely out of Grant's forged complicity. If I waited any longer, if I delayed my strike to protect the theatrical timing of the conservatory event, she would successfully erect a brand new monument on the broken spines of the men she had used. She would walk away completely clean, leaving Grant to take a federal prison sentence while she accepted her philanthropic award. I picked up my phone and dialed Laurel Vance. She answered on the second ring. The timeline just collapsed, I told my attorney, my voice cold and entirely devoid of hesitation. We are out of time. We launch everything tomorrow morning. The collapse of the timeline did not induce panic. It triggered a cold, mechanical focus. I was no longer reacting to Evelyn Sloan. I was designing her exact point of impact. By Saturday morning, my dining room table had been permanently converted into a war room. I divided our counteroffensive into 3 distinct, simultaneous prongs, each meticulously designed to sever a critical artery of her operation. Prong 1 was the dissolution of my marriage. Laurel Vance filed the paperwork with aggressive, immediate prejudice. The divorce filing was no longer about seeking emotional closure. It was a tactical maneuver. By filing immediately and attaching Grant's initial disclosures as sworn discovery, I legally locked his testimony into the public record. If Grant suddenly realized the catastrophic scope of the war and attempted to crawl back to Evelyn for protection, he could not change his story. He was trapped inside his own confession. Prong 2 was the money. Tessa Brewer finalized the financial schematic, and it was a masterpiece of forensic tracking. She mapped the exact flow of currency. Starting from the seemingly innocuous hotel charges and the excessively padded corporate hospitality tabs, Tessa tracked the money as it washed through the digital payment processors and landed directly in the operating accounts of a heavy machinery supply firm. The registered owner of that firm was Blake Sloan, Evelyn's estranged husband. It was a brilliant, closed self-dealing loop. From Blake's supply firm, the capital was laundered right back into the Stonemere central ledger, neatly categorized under the specific project codes for Parcel 9. We packaged this complete, damning financial schematic and routed it via secure, bonded courier directly to the senior risk officers at the three major banks underwriting the Stonemere construction loans. Prong 3 was the narrative. Laurel finalized the sworn affidavits from Colleen, Dana, Elise, and two other former administrative personnel we had located late Friday night. Each affidavit was brutally disciplined. I refused to let them include paragraphs detailing emotional abuse, broken hearts, or ruined self-esteem. Each woman testified to a single, verifiable, and strictly financial link in the chain of fraud. But legal filings and bank reviews operate quietly, buried behind closed doors and corporate non-disclosure agreements. I needed a mechanism to ensure Evelyn could not simply bribe her way out of the shadows before the public ever noticed. I reached out to Nora Bell. Nora was a veteran investigative journalist known for her surgical, merciless takedowns of municipal corruption. I met her in a diner on the outskirts of the city and handed her the entire dossier. Nora was a cynic who trusted spreadsheets far more than she trusted people. She took one look at Tessa's data flow and the stack of sworn affidavits, and her eyes lit up with the predatory gleam of a reporter who knows she is holding a career-defining front page. We negotiated a very specific, unbreakable embargo. Nora agreed to hold the publication of the article until the exact moment the Stonemere Board of Directors received the hard evidence. This sequencing was absolutely vital. It ensured that when the story broke on the wire, Evelyn's crisis management team could not dismiss it as a baseless media ambush orchestrated by a jealous, hysterical wife. The board would already know it was entirely true. Everything was armed. Everything was in place. And then Evelyn handed me the final, devastating piece of the puzzle on a silver platter. Her legal team formally requested a private mediation. It was a desperate, transparent attempt to contain the blast radius before the new work week began. I accepted the invitation. Laurel strongly advised against it, warning me that sitting in a room with a master manipulator like Evelyn was an unnecessary emotional risk. But I knew exactly what I was doing. I needed Evelyn to believe she still had a chance to control the narrative. I needed her to feel arrogant. The mediation took place on Monday afternoon in a sterile, glass-walled conference room at a neutral law firm downtown. The air conditioning was set too high, making the room feel like a meat locker. Evelyn arrived wearing a tailored charcoal suit, radiating an aura of untouchable corporate authority. She did not look at me when she sat down across the massive, polished mahogany table. She looked through me, treating me as an administrative error that simply needed to be erased. For the first hour, the mediator, an older gentleman with a soothing, practiced voice, droned on about finding common ground, avoiding public embarrassment, and preserving mutual dignity. I played my part perfectly. I sat with my hands folded tightly in my lap, my shoulders hunched, projecting the image of a woman who was slowly, painfully realizing she was entirely out of her depth. I let Evelyn guide the conversation. I let her dictate the terms of reality. Then, Evelyn made her fatal error. She leaned forward, steepled her manicured fingers, and addressed the mediator, completely ignoring my presence at the table. My client is willing to offer a highly generous financial settlement to expedite this unfortunate domestic matter, Evelyn's attorney stated. Reading from a prepared brief, Evelyn held up a hand, silencing her own lawyer. She wanted to deliver the killing blow herself. She looked directly into my eyes for the first time, her expression a mask of chilling, practiced disdain. "Let us be absolutely clear about the boundaries of this situation," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. "I am perfectly aware that your husband has been making frantic, baseless claims to justify his own professional incompetence and his personal indiscretions. But the reality is quite simple. Every single legal confirmation, every vendor approval, and every environmental waiver regarding Parcel 9 was executed by Grant Talbot entirely on his own volition. He had full administrative autonomy over those files. I had absolutely no knowledge of his creative accounting, nor did I direct any of his illicit activities. He is a rogue employee attempting to drag my reputation into the mud to save his own skin. So, you assert for the record that you never reviewed the vendor approvals before he signed them?" Laurel asked, her tone carefully neutral, her pen hovering over her yellow legal pad. "I categorically deny any involvement," Evelyn replied firmly, locking her jaw, her eyes blazing with absolute certainty. His actions were his alone. I looked down at the table to hide the brief, triumphant flare in my eyes. I did not pull out the stack of printed emails. I did not throw the evidence in her face. I did not raise my voice or accuse her of perjury. I simply allowed the court reporter sitting quietly in the corner of the room to type those exact words into the official, legally binding transcript of the mediation session. Evelyn had just sworn, on the permanent record, that she had no knowledge of the document alterations and absolutely no hand in the financial coding. She did not know that nestled safely in Tessa Brewer's encrypted hard drive was a very specific email thread from the 14th of April. An email thread where Evelyn explicitly instructed Grant to change the dates on the water testing reports to bypass the Environmental Committee. An email thread where she personally provided the exact phrasing he needed to use when coding their luxury hotel reimbursements into the community outreach budget, so the compliance software would not flag the expense. I did not need to win the argument in that freezing conference room. I just needed her to commit to a lie that I could definitively, mathematically disprove. I stood up slowly. I smoothed the front of my jacket. "I think we are done here," I said quietly. Evelyn offered a thin, victorious smile, clearly assuming I was retreating in the face of her impenetrable, aggressive defense. She thought she had successfully walled herself off from Grant's impending collapse. She thought she had intimidated me into silence. I walked out of the glass-walled room alongside Laurel. The air in the hallway felt incredibly light. I left the mediation session not with a feeling of premature victory, but with something infinitely more valuable. I had a documented, irrefutable contradiction straight from the mouth of a woman whose entire existence depended on controlling the story. She had just confidently built her own gallows. And tomorrow night, on the conservatory stage, I was going to pull the lever. The rain fell in heavy, rhythmic sheets against the living room windows, blurring the streetlights into smeared streaks of yellow. It was Friday evening, exactly 24 hours before the Cedar Vale Civic Conservatory was scheduled to open its grand ballroom doors. The countdown had become a physical weight in my chest, a metronome ticking down to the final collision. A sharp, frantic pounding at the front door shattered the quiet of the house. I did not expect anyone. I walked down the hallway and pulled the door open. Grant stood on the porch, perfectly framed by the violent storm behind him. The transformation in his physical appearance was shocking. The polished, arrogant executive I had thrown out of this house was entirely gone. He was soaked to the bone, his expensive wool overcoat ruined, his hair plastered flat against his skull. His face was gaunt, his cheekbones jutting out sharply beneath hollowed eyes that darted wildly toward the street, as if he expected Stonemere corporate security to step out of the shadows and drag him away. He was shivering violently, clutching a small, silver external hard drive tightly against his chest. "Maya, please," he gasped, his teeth chattering audibly. "You have to let me in. She is going to bury me. She is going to bury me alive." I stepped back, allowing him to stumble into the foyer. He dripped water onto the hardwood floor. I did not offer him a towel. I did not offer him a warm drink. I simply stared at the silver device in his hands. "What is that?" I asked, my voice devoid of any warmth. I breached the restricted project data vault before corporate IT fully purged my access codes, he stammered, his breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts. He practically shoved the drive into my hands. "She thinks she scrubbed the servers, but she missed the secondary backup sector. It is all in there. Maya, everything." I walked over to the dining table, plugged the drive into my laptop, and opened the master folder. It was the holy grail of corporate negligence. Evelyn had sat in a formal mediation room just days ago and sworn on the permanent record that she never touched the vendor approvals. Here, illuminating my screen in high resolution, were the original PDF scans of those exact ledgers. They were covered in Evelyn's distinct digital footprint and her personal electronic signature. She had not just observed the fraud, she had authored it. I clicked through the files, watching a masterclass in financial manipulation unfold. She had manually crossed out a massive environmental penalty charge and typed the phrase "Community Engagement Initiative" directly over it. She had personally approved the illicit hotel invoices, explicitly categorizing the luxury suites under diversity consulting fees to ensure the internal auditing software would blindly pass them through. "Her crisis management firm is issuing a targeted press release on Monday morning," Grant said, his voice cracking as he leaned heavily against the wall. "She has a drafted narrative ready for the business journals. They are going to frame me as a rogue, financially unstable employee who went entirely out of control due to domestic stress. She is handing a curated file to the district attorney. She is going to let me take a federal prison sentence so she can walk onto that stage tomorrow night with clean hands." He looked at me, a pathetic, desperate plea pooling in his eyes. He wanted the wife who fixed his problems. He wanted the woman who had spent 8 years smoothing out the rough edges of his life. "You have to use this to stop her, Maya," he begged. "Save me from this." I slowly closed the laptop screen. I looked at the man I had married, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical utility. "Put your wet coat back on," I instructed him. I did not offer him false hope. I drove him directly to Laurel Vance's law office at 9 o'clock at night. Laurel was waiting in the lobby. We placed Grant in a stark conference room and forced him to dictate a flawless, chronological account of every single document he had falsified under Evelyn's direct supervision. Laurel drafted a 50-page sworn affidavit. When the printer finally stopped running, Grant picked up a heavy black pen. His hand hovered over the signature line. He looked up at me, his eyes searching mine for a pardon. A tiny hint that this shared crisis might miraculously rebuild our broken bridge. "Sign it," I told him, my tone as hard as concrete. "You are not a victim here, Grant. You are simply a witness offering a confession. Your fear is finally useful." He signed his name, legally locking himself into his own ruin. By Saturday morning, the tension had escalated into a suffocating pressure. Only 10 hours remained until the gala. The trap was perfectly assembled, but the ground beneath it suddenly began to shift. Laurel's phone rang at 10 o'clock. It was Howard Pike, the chairman of the Cedar Vale Board. His voice echoed through the speakerphone, thick with corporate cowardice. He had reviewed our confidential, redacted summary, and he was terrified. "We cannot pull the plug on the Legacy Builder Award tonight," Howard argued, his tone defensive and sweating. "Financial mismanagement at Stonemere is a corporate issue, not a conservatory issue. My legal counsel just warned me that if I cancel the honor without absolute proof that Evelyn directly harmed this specific foundation, she will sue the conservatory into bankruptcy for defamation before the sun comes up on Monday. The show has to go on." Nora Bell called 5 minutes later, echoing the exact same crisis. The investigative article was locked, copy-edited, and primed for release. "I have the financial fraud nailed to the wall, Maya," Nora said, the frustration evident in her raspy voice. "But Howard Pike is right. To justify detonating her philanthropic reputation in front of the entire city tonight, we need a solid bridge. I need a single document that proves she used her charity work to explicitly facilitate the corporate crime. Without it, the public will just see a messy corporate dispute interrupting a nice dinner." We were missing the final knot. We needed to tie the Sloan Fellowship directly to the stolen soil of Parcel 9. I immediately called Elise Rowan. I explained the fatal gap in our architecture. Elise was quiet for a long moment, the sound of her bakery clattering softly in the background. "Give me 45 minutes, Elise said. She called back in 30. During her tenure as Evelyn's assistant, Elise had meticulously kept an archive of every speech draft and dictation tape she had ever processed. She had dug into her personal storage drive. "November of 2 years ago," Elise said, her voice vibrating with adrenaline. "A private fundraising dinner for the initial conservatory endowment. Evelyn went off script during the dessert course. I had the audio recording to transcribe later, and I kept the raw file." Elise forwarded the transcript to my encrypted inbox. I opened it and read the exact words Evelyn had spoken to a room full of wealthy donors. It was the ultimate kill shot. Evelyn had explicitly promised the primary financial backers that establishing the philanthropic fund would generate the exact municipal goodwill required to push the Parcel 9 expansion past the pesky Environmental Protection Board. She had literally sold her humanitarian brand to her investors as a sophisticated political bribe to clear the stolen land. I immediately forwarded the transcript to Laurel and Nora. The bridge was built. The trap was absolutely sealed. Howard Pike no longer had a defense. The charity itself was an active weapon in the fraud. The final hours of Saturday afternoon melted away in a blur of intense, silent preparation. At 6 o'clock in the evening, I stood alone in my bedroom. The silence in the house was profound. I stepped into a floor-length, dark emerald silk gown. The fabric was heavy and cold against my skin. I clasped a simple, sharp silver necklace around my throat. I stood before the tall mirror and applied my makeup with a steady, unshakable hand. I looked at the reflection of the woman staring back at me. There was no trace of the devastated wife who had sat crying on the edge of a mattress. There was no hesitation. I was cold, precise, and entirely at peace with the destruction I was about to unleash. I was putting on my armor, I picked up my evening clutch, stepped out of the empty house, and drove toward the glittering lights of the downtown skyline. I was walking into the most glamorous, heavily photographed room in the state, wearing a mask of perfect serenity, fully prepared to extinguish a legacy. The grand ballroom of the Cedar Vale Civic Conservatory was a masterpiece of architectural wealth. At 8 o'clock in the evening, the space was flooded with the warm, golden glow of crystal chandeliers. A string quartet played softly in the corner, entirely masked by the low, steady hum of the city elite networking over champagne. I stood near the back of the room by a massive marble pillar, nursing a glass of sparkling water. I wore my emerald silk gown like armor, watching the exact sequence of events I had engineered slowly begin to unfold. Evelyn Sloane held court near the center stage. She looked immaculate in a tailored white evening dress, projecting the image of a benevolent queen receiving her subjects. She laughed, touching the arms of bank executives and city council members, entirely oblivious to the invisible crosshairs resting squarely on her chest. At 8:45, the lights dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd as the string quartet faded. Howard Pike, the chairman of the board, stepped up to the acrylic podium. He adjusted his microphone, his voice booming across the silent room. He began the grand introduction, speaking of corporate responsibility, feminist leadership, and the dawn of a new era of community integration. He proudly announced that the Legacy Builder Award and the permanent naming rights to the new Minority Scholarship Program belong to the visionary Senior Vice President of Stonemere Urban Holdings. Howard extended his hand toward Evelyn. The spotlight swung, catching her in a blinding circle of white light. She offered a look of practiced humility, pressing one hand to her chest, and took her first step toward the stairs leading up to the stage. She never took the second step. At exactly 8:48, I sent a single text message to Laurel Vance and Nora Bell. The message contained one word: execute. What happened next was not an explosion. It was a silent, creeping plague of illumination. It started at the VIP tables, reserved for the major financial underwriters and the ethics committee members. One by one, their cell phones lit up. Then, the screens of the city council members illuminated. Then, the journalists in the back row. A synchronized wave of blue and white light swept across the darkened ballroom. Laurel and Tessa had just executed a mass delivery of the redacted executive summary, the financial schematics, and the sworn affidavits to every single person of consequence in the room. Simultaneously, Nora Bell pushed her investigative piece live on the City Wire. The headline did not mention an affair. It read, "The Architect of Parcel 9. How Stonemere Built an Empire on Stolen Green Space and Coerced Signatures." The polite applause abruptly faltered. It died entirely within 15 seconds. Howard Pike stood at the podium, looking down at the glowing screen of his own phone. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a wax figure melting under the stage lights. He looked up, his eyes wide with sheer terror, locking onto the table where the chief compliance officer of Stonemere's primary lending bank was already standing up, aggressively dialing his legal department. "Ladies and gentlemen," Howard stammered, his voice cracking over the sound system. He gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned white. "There has been an unexpected development. We must temporarily suspend the program. The board of directors needs to convene an emergency session in the private chambers immediately." The ballroom erupted into a chaotic, buzzing roar. The veneer of polite society shattered. Lenders were shouting at Stonemere executives. The loan for Parcel 9 was effectively frozen before the dessert plates were even cleared from the tables. The board halted the public rollout of the Sloan Fellowship and moved the scholarship fund into protected review, severing Evelyn's name from it before the night was over. Evelyn stood frozen at the base of the stage stairs. The spotlight was still on her, but it no longer looked like a halo. It looked like an interrogation lamp. She turned around, desperately searching the crowd for a friendly face. But the executives who had been kissing her cheek 10 minutes ago were now physically backing away from her, treating her like a walking liability. Through the parting crowd, 3 women walked forward: Colleen Avery, Dana Mercer, and Elise Rowan. They did not shout. They did not cause a scene. They simply stood together near the center aisle, directly in the line of sight of the Ethics Committee. They were the living, breathing verification of the affidavits currently sitting in every inbox in the room. Their presence confirmed to the power brokers that this was not a sudden smear campaign born of jealousy. It was a verified, heavily documented pattern of corporate abuse that had spanned a decade. Then, a hand grabbed my elbow. I turned slightly. Grant stood behind me. He had not been invited to sit at the executive tables, but he had slipped into the back of the room. He looked absolutely hollowed out. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking violently. The investigative article had explicitly named him as a cooperating witness who had surrendered the altered documents. He had already received the automated email from Stonemere Human Resources terminating his employment. His career in commercial real estate was over. The federal investigations would begin on Monday morning. "Maya," Grant whispered, his voice cracking. A desperate, pathetic attempt to find a sliver of sympathy in my eyes. He looked at me as if I might suddenly offer him a door back into the life we used to have. "It is over. Everything is gone." I looked at the man I had spent 8 years building a home with. I felt no rage. I felt no lingering sorrow. I just felt a profound, clean emptiness. "You were not destroyed by me," I said. My voice was low, perfectly calm, and colder than any shouting match could ever be. "You were caught by what you agreed to." I turned my back on him and walked away, leaving him to drown in the consequences of his own signature. Near the front of the room, Evelyn was finally losing her composure. The polished facade cracked violently. She grabbed the sleeve of Howard Pike as he tried to rush off the stage. Her voice, usually so perfectly modulated, rose into a sharp, desperate shriek that cut through the noise of the crowd. "This is a lie!" Evelyn screamed, pointing an accusing finger wildly around the room. "It is a coordinated fabrication, a smear campaign orchestrated by bitter, jealous women who could not handle the pressure of this industry. You cannot do this to me based on the word of a disgruntled assistant and a cheating husband." Howard Pike physically yanked his arm out of her grasp. He held up his phone, displaying the digital copy of the mediation transcript we had legally secured just days prior. "You swore on the legal record that you never saw the vendor approvals," Howard said, his voice laced with absolute disgust. "Nora Bell just published the original PDFs featuring your digital signature and your direct emails instructing the accounting department to falsify the ledgers. You lied to the lenders. You lied to the board. You lied to this charity. You are entirely finished. Evelyn." The entire defensive architecture she had spent 13 years perfecting collapsed right there on the carpet. The emails, the cash flow diagrams, the chronological timelines, and her own arrogant, contradictory statements had trapped her in a cage of her own making. There was no escape hatch. There was no severance package that could cover a federal indictment. I did not stay to watch the police arrive. I did not need to see her cry or drop to her knees. The victory was not in the humiliation. It was in the dismantling. I walked out of the heavy double doors of the ballroom just before midnight. The cool night air hit my face, smelling of rain and wet asphalt. As I stepped into the quiet, dimly lit lobby of the conservatory, I heard a mechanical whirring sound echoing from the main hall behind me. I paused and looked back through the glass panes of the doors. 2 technical staff members had brought out a mechanical lift. They were rising toward the massive, velvet stage backdrop. With swift, unceremonious efficiency, they began unbolting the giant, gold-plated letters that spelled out Evelyn Sloan. I listened to the heavy metallic thud as the first letter hit the stage floor. I smiled, a small, quiet expression of absolute closure. I walked out into the city, finally understanding the truth of what I had done. I had not destroyed a real legacy tonight. I had simply ended a brutal, predatory lie that had masqueraded as a legacy for far too long. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. And please let me know where you are listening from in the comments so we can interact and share our thoughts together. I would love it if you could subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by pressing the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.